Welcome everybody, my name is Lida Liberopoulou and this is the second video in a series examining the historical elements of the games Plague Tale Innocence and Plague Tale Requiem. The first video looked at the historical events referenced in the games, and it ends up that some were accurate while others were not. This time, I'll discuss the locations used in the games. Do they faithfully resemble actual historical sites, or are they mostly products of the game developer's imagination? As always, there will be major spoilers. You have been warned. Okay, let's go. Although both games are set in 14th century France, they deal with their locations in a slightly different way. In Innocence, the only real-world location that's mentioned is that of Aquitaine or Guyenne, which is the general location where the game takes place. Every other location in the game either doesn't have a name or has a name that does not correspond to any real-world place. In addition to that, you often get locations that contain completely imaginary elements mixed with real-world elements from all over Aquitaine. Like Innocence, Requiem avoids the use of real-world names for the game's locations with the exception of the city of Marseille, and furthermore has a lot of mashups of unrelated real-world elements from different locations. As a result of this, there are certain sequences in both games, like the Chateau d'Ombrage and the Roman baths in Innocence, and the river and seaside in Requiem, that are either too generic to identify or have very few historical elements, so I decided to leave them out. But both of them contain enough clues that can determine whether their locations correspond to real-world places or not. We'll go through these locations as they appear in the games. Number 1. The Rune estate. Amicia's and Hugo's family home. You get to explore it at the beginning of the game and you get back to it near the end after it has been taken over by the rats. It is surrounded by walls and support buildings like the stables and the blacksmith's workshop. There's also a pretty decent sized chapel in it. The house itself is not a chateau, but a relatively small two-story manor house with a great hall, kitchen, private quarters, and other rooms that you would expect to find in this type of building. It even has a large garden through which you escape at the end of the first chapter. All in all, the Rune estate is more or less the exact setup you would expect to find as the home of a member of the petty nobility in 14th century France. And although I couldn't find a real-world manor house that has this specific layout, there are a few manor houses in France that look similar and are still in use. Number 2. The village. The infected village is where Amicia and Hugo come face to face with the effects of the plague on the local population. It is situated near the river, and at the entrance of the village we find the market. The houses are tightly built together with narrow meandering streets that lead to a central square where they come across the horrific scene of the villagers burning people at the stake. In the streets we occasionally find shops, and we even enter something that appears to be a leather workshop. This is how an actual medieval village would look like, and it's clearly based on the medieval villages that still exist around the Dordogne area of Aquitaine. More specifically, the villages of Dôme and Benac-et-Casnac. The only things that are a bit off are the marketplace being at the entrance instead of the center of the village, and the tanning workshop being inside the village instead of the outskirts. Number 3. The Monastery. After going through the village, Amicia and Hugo arrive at the hilltop monastery where they encounter the rat swarm for the first time. They enter the monastery's chapel before getting to the abbey's cloister where they encounter Father Thomas. After Father Thomas gets killed by the rats, Amicia and Hugo go through a series of rooms and eventually end up in the dormitory. Then they enter the infected crypt from which they escape. Though the monastery's general layout loosely mirrors that of a typical medieval monastery, it doesn't precisely match any of the real-world monasteries in Aquitaine. However, its elements appear to be borrowed from various sources. For example, the exterior of the chapel closely resembles the chapel atop the castle of Benac-et-Casnac, while the interior seems to be inspired by the Abbey of Fontenay. This location also has my favorite room in the game, the monastery's communal toilet, also known as the Redorter. Medieval and ancient Roman toilets are always great fun and more games should have them. Number 4. The Town. The town appears twice in the game. First when Amicia retrieves the Sanguinis Itinera, and later when she, Hugo and the rest of the team face off against Grand Inquisitor Palpatine. From the beginning of the In the Shadows of Ramparts chapter, it's clear that this is a big town located next to a river and featuring large bridges. It has impressive fortifications and towers, designed in the French style, and the town's layout is full of winding narrow streets, marketplace squares, and the typical mess one would expect from a medieval city. I mean, this is obviously Bordeaux, which was at the time, and still is, Aquitaine's capital city, and it's also where the game developers' Asobo studio is based. While the basic layout aligns with that of an authentic medieval town, there are a few things that are off. For instance, at some point, Amicia ends up in a plaza featuring a large gallows gibbet structure with hanging bodies. While this does provide an interesting in-game obstacle for the player, it does not exist in historical Bordeaux. However, it is based upon a real structure, the gibbet of Montfaucon, the large gallows that stood in Paris from the 13th century until 1760. Amicia also encounters one of Bordeaux's famous landmarks, the Grosse Cloche, or Big Bell Tower. Although the tower did exist, it was constructed around 1250, the belfry was added to it in the 15th century, 100 years after the events depicted in the game. But the biggest problem here is number 5, the university. This is where things start to get off the rails. Amicia is supposed to go to the university that's situated deep in the center of the city to get the Sanguinis Itinera. When she gets there, she discovers a vast building with room after room and corridor after corridor filled with books and even a massive secret library underneath the building. Well, none of what you see here would ever exist anywhere in the 14th century. Even if Bordeaux had a university at the time, which it didn't, it wouldn't look anything like this. Medieval universities didn't even have dedicated buildings, let alone a massive cathedral-like structure. Often classes took place in rented rooms, private homes, even outdoors. Also, there was absolutely no way you would have a massive library with thousands upon thousands of books. In fact, medieval universities typically didn't have libraries. Anyone wanting to study had to buy their books or access a monastery library. The only French university with a library at the time was that of Paris, and that barely had 1,000 books in it. So basically, almost everything you see in the game has more to do with the popular culture image of what a medieval university would look like than what it actually was. Number 6. The Bastion. The Bastion is the base of operations for the Inquisition. It is also the place where Beatrice, Amicia's and Hugo's mother, is imprisoned and where Grand Inquisitor Palpatine carries out his alchemical experiments. However, as I pointed out in the initial video of this series, the real-life medieval Inquisition did not operate from a central headquarters, nor was it involved in alchemical experiments. And obviously, this weird mixture of Gothic cathedrals, laboratories, workshops, dungeons, anatomical theaters, and rooms for human and rat experiments is clearly imaginary, since such a complex could not have existed in the 14th century. Like the game's university, there's no real equivalent to this structure, but I've managed to identify a couple of real-world inspirations for some parts of it. The cloisters area seems to be influenced by the actual cloisters of the Cadouin Abbey in Dordogne, and the anatomical room appears to take inspiration from the anatomical theatre at the University of Bologna. The other areas look quite generic, making it difficult for me to identify any parallels with real-world structures. Number 7. The Cathedral. Near the end of the game, we encounter the infected Cathedral, the stage for a weird boss fight involving tornadoes of black and white rats, rat towers, and rat earthquakes. Since the game is set in Bordeaux, you might expect this to be the Bordeaux Cathedral, right?
Wrong.
This is the real-world main entrance of the Bordeaux Cathedral. In fact, the cathedral in the game is more like the exteriors of the Amiens Cathedral or the Reims Cathedral. In addition to that, the interior is almost identical to that of the Amiens Cathedral. So while it's clear that the game is inspired by real-world architecture, the models used here are not associated with the actual structures present in Bordeaux. Overall, in Innocence, the locations and buildings are a mix of designs based on real-world equivalent structures and locations, compromises between historical accuracy and environmental level design conventions, and popular culture ideas of what these places looked like. But does this apply also to the locations of Requiem? Requiem takes place in two main locations, the region of Provence and the Mediterranean island of Cuna. Provence is of course a real-world location in the southeast of France. Cuna is a bit more complicated, but we'll get to that. So let's start with the Provence locations. Number 1. The Red City. It is the first location encountered after the tutorial area and consists of several subsections. Amicia's journey begins at the marketplace. From there, her path leads into the ruins of a Roman amphitheater, then the butcher's district, and then to the city's edge to find the herbalist. She ends up a prisoner in the castle overlooking the city, then escapes through the river docks, and finally boards Joseph's barge and leaves the Red City through the marshlands. Like most villages and towns in the games, the layout of the Red City is more or less the layout you would expect in a medieval port city, and the surrounding landscape corresponds to the Mediterranean landscape of Provence. But which city is this? The most distinguishing landmark is of course the Roman amphitheater, and there are several locations in Provence with well-preserved ruins of Roman amphitheaters. But the one in the game is distinctive due to the very prominent tower where you find Vaudin the alchemist. And this is clearly the amphitheater in Arles. Much like its real-life counterpart, the in-game amphitheater is near a river and during medieval times was itself a town housing 4 towers, nearly 200 homes and 2 chapels within its boundaries. So this is clearly Arles. Well, not quite. The real-world Arles is situated on a large plain with no mountains or hills surrounding it, and there is no medieval castle overlooking the city. Also, Arles is not full of red-colored buildings. So, where does the inspiration for this landscape and city layout come from? Well, my guess is that the design is based on Roussillon, a medieval town in Provence that has a very similar layout and a distinctive reddish tint on its buildings. So the Red City is probably a mix between elements of Arles, Roussillon, and a couple of other places. Number 2. The Ochres. After the river sequence, Hugo and Amicia find themselves in a region where the deep red of ochre dominates the landscape. They go through a quarry and then a canyon which features what appears to be a medieval dye factory. It's pretty obvious that this location mirrors the ochre-rich Luberon region. It is an area full of cliffs, hills, small canyons, quarries, and weird geological formations, all covered in bright red, orange, and yellow earth colors. Also, the game's quarry is identical to the ochre mines of Brou, a vast labyrinth of galleries that stand 15 meters tall and span a total length of 40 kilometers. But although the dye factory is not that off from what you would find in medieval times, the mine tunnels are historically inaccurate. In the 14th century, ochre was not mined on an industrial scale, but gathered from the surface deposits. The extensive mining of ochre happened in the 19th century because of advances in mining technology and the growing demand for pigments. So Amicia and Hugo would not go through the mine tunnel section simply because the mines wouldn't be there. So when it comes to the real-world historical elements in the game's Provence locations, that's pretty much it. And I'm afraid it doesn't get better with Cuna's locations. As I said before, Cuna is a bit more complicated than Provence, so I need to explain a few things before we get to its locations. According to the game's development team, the inspiration for Cuna came from Majorca, the largest of the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean. My guess is that it was chosen because it was under Byzantine rule during the reign of Emperor Justinian, which matches the game's theme of Vasilius and the Justinian plague. However, there are very few architectural remains from this historical period on the island. Also, this is where the game doesn't just deviate from reality, but launches itself into space and eventually lands smack in the middle of Yoggoth. Basically, here things start going beyond the fantastical and into the realm of the surreal. Also, from this point on, the historical elements within the game become scarce. In fact, there are so few of them that I will have to bundle the Cuna locations into groups. Still, it is possible to identify some real-world elements here, so let's see what we can find. Numero uno. The village, the palace, and the Roman theatre. Hugo, Amicia, Arnaud and Sophia first arrive at the village where Arnaud attacks the count and gets arrested. Then Hugo and Amicia are invited in the palace and then start their exploration in search of clues for the location that appears in Hugo's dream. They revisit these two locations much later when Amicia is trying to escape the island after the plague rats have been unleashed and are wreaking havoc everywhere. The Roman theatre is where Beatrice is murdered and Amicia has her duel with the Count. All these locations have some connection with the real-world Majorca, but not much. The village appears to be an idyllic mashup of some of the more picturesque villages of Majorca like Valdemosa and Fornaluch. Beyond that, I couldn't find any identifiable landmarks. The palace is clearly inspired by the royal palace of La Almudaina, but it's much larger and more opulent than the real thing. There are also a couple more landmarks that are sort of recognizable, like the windmills, which are a very common sight in Majorca. Almost everything else, like the phoenix statues, the ruins with the mosaic map, and the tower, do not correspond to real-world landmarks. As for the game's theatre, although there is a Roman theatre in Majorca, it is just a ruin with little remaining beyond its foundations. My guess is that the one depicted in-game draws inspiration from the Roman theatre in Orange. Numero dos. The Sanctuary, the Fort, and the Temple. The Sanctuary is the structure inside the mountain which contains the room where Vasilius, the previous carrier of the macula, was experimented on by the Order. The fort is where you find the chapel, and the underground temple is home to the tomb of Vasilius. None of these locations exist in the real-world Majorca. Instead, they are a weird mashup of various historical locations and architectural elements from all over the Mediterranean. The entrance to the sanctuary likely draws inspiration from places such as Petra and the Lycian rock-cut tombs of Dalian. Within the sanctuary, there are elements inspired by large Byzantine churches, such as the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Other smaller design features, like the arches in the area with the large weeping willow, are typical in Byzantine architecture. The fort's tower design is probably inspired by the towers of Constantinople's walls, and the chapel with its brick and plaster construction and half domes has the standard Byzantine chapel design. The underground temple is among the more fantastical locations in the game. It has various Byzantine architectural elements, with the more notable being the mechanical bridge area, which looks like the Basilica cistern in Constantinople. Beyond that, there is very little in all three of these locations that relate to the real Majorca or any other real-world place. The final location in the game is the city of Marseille, which historically was the ground zero for the Black Death in France. This is where the ships carrying the plague from the Black Sea city of Kaffa first arrived in early 1348. So it's fitting that this is where Hugo merges with the macula and nearly destroys everything. Besides this, there's not much to say about it. In-game Marseille is a surreal landscape that has nothing to do with medieval Marseille or any other town at any point in history. But, to be fair, it has some really impressive designs and one of the most heartbreaking moments in game history. So that's it. That is what I managed to find about the locations in both games. The historical accuracy of the locations in Innocence is pretty much the same as the historical accuracy of the game's other elements. Also, surprisingly, Requiem has better historical accuracy in its locations compared to its story elements, at least in the first act. However, in the second and third acts, all semblance of historical accuracy is thrown out of the window. Still, the games had more effort put into them than I expected, so I'd say decent job overall. Thank you for watching. This series was a tough one, but I did enjoy making it. If you managed to find any other connections between the in-game and real-world locations, please let me know in the comments. Also, I might make a third video about the historical objects you can find in the games, but that will be at a much later time. My channel focuses on history in video games, so please subscribe, because where else would you learn that the loaves of bread in Fabia's bakery in the Forgotten City are based on an almost perfectly preserved carbonized loaf of bread found in Herculaneum? Well, here. That is where you're going to learn this stuff. You can also check out my previous videos and my archaeological reconstructions in VR project, and you can also support me on Patreon so I can make more of these videos. I put the links on the screen. And for now, Ave atque Vale.